and welcome to this podcast on the English and Welsh legal system with Ryan Murphy. Today, we're going to be exploring the features of a statute. So, any level of legal study or legal practice, you will come across acts of Parliament. And the purpose of today's podcast is just to talk you through some of the features that you might find in acts of Parliament so that you can better navigate, find, and use the various aspects of statute law. So on the screen now you can see some of the features that we're going to be talking about only very, very briefly. Those that appear in all Acts of Parliament, those that appear in older Acts of Parliament like the Regnal Year and the Preamble, and some extraneous material that's not actually part of the statute but helps to explain the statute, things like the explanatory notes. So if you wanted to pause the recording now, you can, and have just a little bit, think about those different features before resuming with an exploration of each of those features. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the Employment Rights Act 1996 as an example of an Act of Parliament. What I've done is I've chopped it up into different pieces and identified some of its key features for you to look at. And so the Employment Rights Act is a fairly typical Act of Parliament. It's quite long. It's what we would call a consolidating Act of Parliament. It brought together all different bits and pieces of employment law into one single act. So let's make a start and explore some of the features of an Act of Parliament. So the first thing that you'll note is that Acts of Parliament have the Royal Coat of Arms on them to represent the fact or to indicate the fact that the Act is made under the authority of the Queen in Parliament. And so the Queen, or the monarch, is the constitutional head of state of the United Kingdom, and therefore of the legal jurisdiction of England and Wales. And the Royal Coat of Arms just indicates that it has the approval of the monarch. Then moving on, we can see the short title. So this is the title by which the Act is normally known. So here we can see that it's the Employment Rights Act 1996, and surprisingly it was passed in 1996. And you can often gather some sort of understanding of the nature and content of an Act of Parliament from its short title. Then you have its citation, and in particular what we can see here is the chapter number. Now we'll revisit different forms of chapter as they appear as features of the statute, but here the chapter refers to the number of an Act of Parliament in a given year. So this will be the 18th Act of Parliament to gain royal assent in 1996. Older Act of Parliaments, as we'll come to discover right at the end of this podcast, have something called the Regnal Year. So that's the year that relates to the year of the reign of the monarch under whose authority the Act of Parliament was issued. But in more modern times and more recent times, this system has been simplified somewhat to contain only reference to chapter numbers. So moving through the Act of Parliament and moving into some of the detail or some of the early aspects of an Act of Parliament, what can we see here? So we can see the long title. And the long title here for the Employment Rights Act is an act to consolidate enactments relating to employment rights. And so a long title here doesn't necessarily mean it has to be particularly lengthy. Here it's quite a short long title. But nonetheless, the long title is useful because it gives an additional indication as to the nature and the contents of an Act of Parliament. So by looking at this Act of Parliament, we can see that this is a consolidating act, something that I mentioned previously. We know it's relating to employment rights. Next, we have the date on which the Act of Parliament received its royal assent. So this is the 22nd of May 1996. And the royal assent is the final stage in the legislative process. And so it's the date on which the Queen gave her, or the monarch gave their assent to the Act of Parliament, the final concluding stage for a bill, a proposed law, a draft law, to become an Act of Parliament in the English legal system. And then every Act of Parliament has a confirmatory statement on it called the enacting formula. And the enacting formula is shown on the screen, And the enacting formula is confirmation that the Act of Parliament has passed through the requisite levels of the process for it to become an Act of Parliament. Broadly speaking, there are two forms of enacting formula. This is the most common one, the one that demonstrates that the Queen, the House of Lords, and the House of Commons have approved an Act of Parliament, so that a bill so that it can become an Act of Parliament and thereby law. The other form of enacting formula that you might see in some acts, but very, very few, is an adapted one where, under very, very limited circumstances, the House of Lords is not required to give its approval to an Act of Parliament, and the enacting formula for those acts reads slightly different. One thing that you can do is you could go and try and find an Act of Parliament that was enacted under the Parliament Acts 1919 and 1949 and see how the different enacting formula is used in those Acts of Parliament. Moving on then, we can look at the different, going into the detail, more of the detail of the Act of Parliament. We can see some of the major features of the Act of Parliament. So here we have part numbers and part headings. So longer Acts of Parliament are split into multiple parts, each part dealing with a particular area. So they're all given Roman numeral numbering. So this is part 1 of the Employment Rights Act 1996, and you can see from its heading that it concerns something called employment particulars. This is not something you need to know about, but they're an important aspect of employment law, particularly as someone commences employment. The next thing that we can see is the bolded number 1 here is a section number. And so what you might have heard in sort of your experiences of law today is people referring to sections of Acts of Parliament. Section 15 or Section 25 or Section 21 or Section 18, the Offence Against the Persons Act, for example. And the sections are the way of splitting down the individual or aspects of the individual rules that are contained within an Act of Parliament. So we can see here that we have section numbers, and over the other side we have a marginal note or a section heading. So each section will have a marginal note, a note in the margins of the printed Act of Parliament, which gives some indication of what the section is about. If you're looking at the Act of Parliament in a digital version, so if you're looking at legislation.gov.uk, then that marginal note is actually included next to the section number. And so you get a better indication instantly of what the section is about. There is some debate whether and to what extent section numbers, section headings form part of Acts of Parliament, or whether they are just annotations to Acts of Parliament. But it's really, really important that you understand this concept of a section. So a section is a particular given rule or statement of the law or of principle that's contained within an Act of Parliament. If we then break that down even further, you will notice various levels of indentation in Acts of Parliament. So here you can see that this is 4, and then there's an open bracket, 1 closed bracket, and that is has a particular meaning. And then later that you can see that it goes to even further levels of indentation. So you have an A in brackets, so you have a Roman numeral I in brackets. And these all have particular names. And it's important that you start to come to terms with some of the terminology surrounding the study and application of law. So let's have a quick look. So here we have a section. So this is section 4. And within section 4, you'll notice that bolded 4 is the section number. You have numerous things. So you have subsections. So you have sections and subsections, both of which have regular number use. So 4 open brackets, 1 closed brackets is section 4, subsection 1. Or some people would say section 4(1). So that's the normal parlance, that's the normal way in which we refer to these things, but in a technical term, the biggest thing, the biggest unit is a section, a section being broken down into subsequent subsections. And that's where a particular rule, a particular principle is too difficult to articulate in a very, very short paragraph, over a couple of lines, and therefore it needs to be split down into its component parts. And then sitting below subsection level are paragraphs. So here we can see that this is section 4, subsection 2, paragraph B. Or as people would probably say, section 4 to B. So those are paragraphs. So again, if a subsection needs to be broken down into smaller units, you get to the level of paragraph. And then finally, the lowest level, the lowest unit that you can have, the smallest unit you can have is a subparagraph. So sections might be split into subsections, paragraphs, and subparagraphs. And it's important that you have some kind of sense of the flow of these things. So if you're asked to find subsection 2 of section 4 of the Employment Rights Act 1976, you're able to do that with accuracy. If we look to particular aspects of Acts of Parliament, very particular sections within Acts of Parliament, there are two that are of particular interest and relevance to the study of the English legal system. The first is commencement. So Acts of Parliament become law when they gain royal assent. But actually they may not be in force, or they may not commence immediately. And so Acts of Parliament will have a commencement section, normally one of the last final sections in an Act of Parliament, which tells you when that act will come into force. Yeah, so it becomes law, but it might not be in force. And so here we see section 243 of the Employment Rights Act is a commencement section. So it says, this act shall come into force at the period, at the end of the period of 3 months beginning with the day on which it is passed. So Acts of Parliament do not always, or even typically, come into force immediately at royal assent. They may come into force on a date specified within the Act of Parliament. And so when you're looking at law on the books, you're looking at legislation.gov.uk, you're looking at a piece of legislation, it's really, really important for you to determine whether it's in force as a whole, whether parts of it are in force, and if so, which parts are in force. And so what you need to start to get into the habit of doing is checking whether an act has had a commencement order, if it's to come into order at a much later date, or whether the Act of Parliament itself specifies. So broadly speaking, there are three possibilities. That the Act commences when it's gained royal assent, so immediately, at a specified date in the future, as does the Employment Rights Act 1996. It tells us that it comes into force 3 months after the date in which it's passed. Or what sometimes happens is that the date of commencement is left to be determined by secondary legislation. So a minister is given power to pass, to bring into force the Act or bits of the Act on an unspecified date in the future. And so you can immediately, defined date, undefined date, later confirmed by secondary legislation. So that's commencement. And then there are extent sections. So extent demonstrates exactly which of the jurisdictions, exactly which parts of the UK this Act of Parliament will apply in. So the UK has several countries, but it also has distinct jurisdictions, legal jurisdiction. In England and Wales, it's one jurisdiction, Scotland another, and Northern Ireland another. And so what an Act may do is tell you, an Act may tell you where it will apply. So if we look at this, the Employment Rights Act 1996, section 244(1 says, subject to the following provisions, this Act extends to England and Wales and Scotland, but not to Northern Ireland. So this Act will apply within the legal jurisdiction of England and Wales and within the legal jurisdiction of Scotland, but it will not apply to the legal jurisdiction of Northern Ireland. And then, if we look at subsection 2, it says the provisions of this Act which refer to shop workers and betting workers, extend to England and Wales only. So what's really, really interesting about this Act of Parliament is that different bits of it apply to different legal jurisdictions. So all of it applies to England, Wales, Scotland, and not Northern Ireland, subject to something we'll say in a moment. The stuff relating to within the Act to shop workers and betting workers don't only extend to England and Wales and don't even extend to Scotland. And so you can see that this complex picture soon builds up about the extent of the applicability of an Act to different legal jurisdictions. And then finally, if we look at subsection 3, it says that actually aspects of this Act, despite what it says in subsection 1, do apply to Northern Ireland. And so you have all of the different legal jurisdictions that operate within the United Kingdom having different levels of application of Acts of Parliament. And it's really important that you know not only when Acts of Parliament commence, when they start, but also to which of the jurisdictions of within the United Kingdom the Act applies to. If we then go one level deeper, we can see here in a summary of the Act, which will appear right at the start of the Act after the coat of arms and all that sort of stuff. You can see how an Act is structured in its broadest sense. So it will have parts and a part number, which you can see here. This is part 10 that's displayed on the screen. It will tell you what that part is about. It's about unfair dismissal generally. And then actually, if it's a particularly complex area of law, or if it's an area of law with lots of detailed rules, it may be broken down even further into chapters. And so what you might get is multiple chapters within a part of an Act. This part governs unfair dismissal, part 10. Chapter 1 governs the right not to be unfairly dismissed, and then chapter 2 governs the remedies if you are unfairly dismissed. And so what we can see here when we look at the different chapter numbers, we look at the different part numbers, we look at the different chapter titles, you can start to see the sort of common structure of an Act. And an Act may have parts and chapters. Within the part, you will find chapters. Within the chapters, you'll find sections. Within the sections, you'll find subsections. Within the subsections, you'll find paragraphs. Within the paragraphs, you'll find subparagraphs. And whilst that sounds very complicated, it gives Acts a common structure, which means that over time, you will become more and more familiar. The more Acts of Parliament you look at, you'll become more familiar with those features. So right at the end of the Act, you will find something called schedules. So schedules can form a number of purposes. They can give definitions, they can give very, very detailed rules about how an Act of Parliament is to apply and not to apply. And in the case here, you can see that because this was a consolidating Act, it brought together lots of different Acts of Parliament, then it may be the case that it has to amend or repeal lots of other Acts of Parliament. And what a schedule is really handy and really useful for is it can list all the things that have been changed as a result of this Act of Parliament, or equally, it can lay down all the things that have been repealed as a result of this Act of Parliament. And if we turn our attention to older Acts of Parliament, if you look at very old Acts of Parliament, they may contain something called a preamble. A preamble is intended to act in a not dissimilar way to the long title of more modern Acts of Parliament. It gives a summary of the contents, the reasoning, and the processes of the different acts, of the different aspects of this Act of Parliament. And as I mentioned right at the outset, that some older Acts of Parliament are referenced not by the number of the Act in a given year, but rather by reference to the session and year of reign of the monarch who was on the throne at the time that the Act was passed. And then finally what you have is something very useful, external to the Act. It's not part of the Act, it doesn't form part of the binding law of an Act of Parliament, and that's the explanatory notes. Now, explanatory notes are there to give the government's view, in particular for a public bill, to give the government's view in much more laid terms of what the purpose of the Act is, why it was needed, and to explain the various sections of that Act of Parliament. So it gives a more useful everyday summary of the Act of Parliament. So if you're really struggling to figure out what an Act is trying to say, what you might do is turn to the explanatory notes, where you might get a clearer summary or a clearer idea of what it was that the draftspeople were trying to achieve. And then finally, what I would like you to turn your attention to is a little activity. On the screen, you can see a link, or you can go to legislation.gov.uk and just search the Protection of Badgers Act 1992. So this is an act, probably one of my favourite acts of Parliament, if you're allowed such a thing as a favourite act of Parliament, and it governs, unsurprisingly, the protection of badgers. And it's a relatively short act of Parliament, it's relatively easy to understand. It's something about which you might have a contextual understanding, this protection of wildlife. What I'd like you to do is, using that link above, or Googling, or using a search engine to find legislation.gov.uk, find the Protection of Badgers Act, and see how many features of a statute that have already been discussed in this short podcast you can find in that Act of Parliament. See if you could label that Act of Parliament with its relevant parts, including the coat of arms, commencement, section numbers, etc., etc. Also, there will be some that you can't find in the Protection of Badgers Act 1992, and I'd like you to put some thought to why might they be missing? Why don't Acts of Parliament all have, for example, subsections or subparagraphs or other features? Why might some features be missing? What does that tell you about the nature and the scope of that particular Act of Parliament? Thank you very much for listening. That's all for now, and I hope that you found this useful. Thank you.